Hi, and welcome to another edition of Editorial Content. Today's episode is not technically sponsored, but I'd like to make a shout out to the upcoming convention Too Many Games, happening at the Greater Philadelphia Expo Center in Oaks, June 15th through the 17th. I may be attending the thing, if only because the Angry Video Game Nerd is going to be there. If it wasn't for him, this genre of programming would never have existed. So I've got to give my props to him. Today I'm going to talk about the add-on consoles. See, the history of video games is a rather fascinating subject, because it's kind of fun to research what made it in the market and what didn't. And especially since I was on the sidelines for some of this stuff, I may not have known what all of it was, but it's still quite fun to look back into it. Apparently, in the early to mid-1990s, video game hardware manufacturers thought it would be a good idea, instead of making completely new hardware, to make hardware that piggybacked off of their existing products. Now, a lot of people have questioned why. Why wouldn't you just make a whole new console? I mean, the Angry Video Game Nerd, I'm jumping back to him for a moment, has posed the same question, and you know what? I can understand it from the manufacturer's point of view. I mean, it allows them to, in theory, explore new capabilities and expand their market base, while keeping costs down since they don't have to spend the money building new hardware from the ground up. In theory. The problem was, you can't really expand your market base with this kind of thing because this requires one of their earlier products to run. We'll start our exploration with the TurboGrafx-CD, which came out in 1991 for the TurboGrafx-16, or the PC Engine in Japan in 1989. Some of you may remember the TGCD's Johnny Turbo comics, which, being a laughably bad attempt at a mascot, really tried to hammer in the point that, hey, we made this sort of thing first. Not the Sega CD, that wasn't first. Not the 3DO, I know it's its own console, but not the CDI. The TGCD was first. And how does that help you exactly? Yeah, funny thing about the TGCD, it had over 400 games made for it, compared to the to like under 100, like 90 games for the base TG16. Only problem is, only 45 of those CD games made it in America, like outside of Japan, because the TG16 was such a hit in Japan and hardly so anywhere else. They didn't feel the need, I guess. Are there any noteworthy games for the TG16? One of the most famous I can think of is Castlevania Rondo of Blood. At first, it was a Japan-only game. They got a kinda sorta port called Castlevania Dracula X for the Genesis. I think it was a Super NES one as well. It finally got a real re-release for the PSP and the Wii Virtual Console. So if you want to play it on something you'll actually own, I'd start with those. There's also the Ys, Book 1 and 2, and Ys 3, plus the Japan-only 4th game. They also had a port of Snatcher, which we'll see later on the Sega CD. This one was Japan only. We'll talk about that later. Oh, and one of the launch titles was Fighting Street, a port of the original Street Fighter game from 1987. And it sucked. Okay, moving on to the Sega CD. This was an add-on for the Sega Genesis starting in 1992. Now, the Angry Video Game Nerd, I know I'm talking about him a lot, he doesn't have a video for the TG-CD, but he's got one talking about the Sega CD. Now, coming from around the time where we got the Philips CDI and the 3DO multiplayer, apparently developers thought the wave of the future was through multimedia, specifically full motion video. The problem is, you can't make much of a game based on full motion video. A lot of it's going to be like point-and-click adventures or games following the format of Dragon's Lair, if anyone remembers that. In fact, there was a port of Dragon's Lair for the Sega CD. Now, out of all of the expansion consoles I'm going to be talking about in this episode, the Sega CD has probably the most interest in it, certainly the most and the best games, well, except for the TG-CDs ones, which didn't make it out of Japan. Probably everyone's going to talk about Sonic CD. It's Sonic the Hedgehog. It's a 2D Sonic the Hedgehog game. That's all you need to know. I could probably do a whole review on Sonic CD alone. It's that interesting and it's that good. However, it recently got ports for the PS3, Xbox 360, and the iPhone. I've got that one, like for the iPod Touch. So, barring that, they've also got the first two games in the Lunar series, the RPG series, and Snatcher. I mentioned this before as some sort of point-and-click adventure game created by Hideo Kojima, the guy who made Metal Gear. This was the only port of Snatcher that came out of Japan. It came outside of Japan, like in North America and Europe. And in terms of bad games, there's also Night Trap. People horribly misunderstood the level of violence in this game. Long story short, you're trying to protect these co-eds by running the security system and not letting the bad guys drain their energy, okay? Got that out of the way. I'm going to stay with the Genesis add-ons for this next one. The Sega 32X launched in 1994. Unlike the other guys, this one ran on cartridges, and the idea when Sega made this, like, they knew the Saturn, the new console, the Sega Saturn, was in the pipeline, and their original plan was to let the consumer get a jump start on the 32-bit generation, and in a more value-oriented flavor. Like, the 32X was originally sold at $150 US versus $300 for the upcoming Saturn. I think that's what it was. But the public knew that the Saturn was on the horizon, so why bother jumping the gun on the 32X, you know? Any noteworthy games? Like, there was only one Sonic the Hedgehog game, and it didn't even star Sonic. It was Knuckles Chaotix. Probably also deserves its own review, or at the very least, I'm working on a list of top 10 best and top 10 worst Sonic the Hedgehog games. Sorry to digress for a minute. and I wish to speak more about Knuckles Chaotix there. It's bad, but it's a very unique kind of bad. They've also got Doom, which again, you've got multiple ports of this game, so why bother? Virtua Fighter, pretty good, actually, but I think there's a Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn, much the same. Virtua Racing Deluxe, re-release of an updated re-release of the guide they made for Genesis. I can think of Mortal Kombat 2. Again, probably got its own set of ports. If you absolutely have to explore these kinds of things, the 32X would be a cheap starting point, but there's not much worthwhile for it. Also, I should mention that the Sega CD and the 32X are only compatible with the first two models of the Genesis. The big one with the 16-bit printed on it, and the second one, the medium-sized black box. If you've got the later Genesis 3 or anything after that, you're out of luck. Not that you'll be missing much anyway. And finally, we talk about the Jaguar CD, which I believe launched in 1995. This is just a mystery. The Jaguar was a rather unpopular console. Why did Atari not know that? Why did they press on to make the CD add-on? And most notably, these days, this thing has a notoriously bad quality reputation from what I've seen. I mean, the AVGN, again, and Spoonie, between the two of them, 3 different units of those conked out. Failed to read anything. And any good games on it? Like, I don't know. There's Battle Morph, a surprisingly improved sequel to the original Jaguar's Space Flight Sim Cybermorph. Other than that, I can't think of many other unique games. It's a total washout. Forget it. Last but probably least, this is a dealie that did not leave Japan, and for good reason. The Nintendo 64 disk drive from 1999, or 64DD for short, which I'm reading that as the cup size for a very fat girl. No offense to anyone whose breast size actually happens to be 64DD. I can't imagine that, but who knows? Gotta cover my back. I remember reading previews for this thing in Nintendo Power, and when it finally came out, they only made 9 games for that. That's less than the Virtual Boy, if you can believe that. This was a bigger flop than the Virtual Boy, and understandably, it never showed hide or hair of itself in America, or anywhere outside of Japan. To that I say, good riddance. There's a lot more items I could be talking about, but they sort of don't count. Like, I'm thinking of the HD DVD drive for the Xbox 360, the Wii Motion Plus for the Wii. Technically it's a peripheral, but I might count it in there if I had to. But I think this video has been running long enough. So, if I have enticed you with any of these, I implore you, do your research before looking out for any new video game hardware. Like, know what games are available for it. If it sparks your interests, go for it. But please be sensible about it. And if not, I hope I have at least inspired you to explore video game history further, because I found it to be a really fascinating subject. So I'm going to lay my knowledge to rest now. Goodbye, peoples.